It's a great event for Mongolia because it makes the history of Mongolia more visible, the role and the place of Mongolia more visible, making or by putting the Halkhengol event or Nomonhan event of 1939 into its proper geostrategic perspective, it makes Mongolia more visible. It makes Mongolia's international stance more heightened. And it's my great pleasure to introduce you all know him, to introduce to you Dr. Goldman, great friend of Mongolia. We at the embassy appreciate very much this brilliant work, which is a valuable contribution to historiography of Mongolia, to historical studies of what happened during last century and in 1939 in eastern Mongolia. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Gakwan. That's such a kind and gracious introduction. And I want to thank you and your colleagues for helping with your hospitality for this event. This is a big day for me, and I am very excited, and I'm thrilled and honored to be here. I think most of you know that this project has been in my head for more than 40 years. This was the title of my doctoral dissertation at Georgetown, which I wrote in the late 1960s. A few years ago, when I brought this project to the Naval Institute Press, my editor Adam Kane, who's here, and Rick Russell, the director of the Naval Institute Press, were both here. Thank you very much. For a year, we had the working title of this book being The Most Important World War II Battle You Never Heard of. Eventually, we decided that was a little too cute for the Naval Institute Press, which does serious military and political and diplomatic history. And so we wound up with this, Nomonhan, 1939, the Red Army's victory that shaped World War II. This book tells two stories. The first part describes this little-known and seemingly obscure conflict between the Soviet Union and its ally Mongolia, and Japan and its client state, puppet state of Manchuria, at that time called Manchukuo. In the Japanese language, this conflict is Nomonhan Jiken, the Nomonhan incident. In the Russian language and the Mongolian, it's Boil Khalkhengol, the Battle of Khalkhengol. Because Khalkhengol, with the I decided it would be too hard for Americans to pronounce and remember. I decided to go with the Japanese of the battle for the title of the book. The second half of the story is about the geostrategic significance and the historical significance of this battle, which influenced Stalin's decision to 1939, leading directly to the outbreak of the Second World War in Europe, and 2 years later, significantly influenced decisions in Tokyo and Moscow in 1941 that actually shaped the conduct and in no small way the outcome of the war. First, a little background. Early 20th century, China enters into what we historians call end of dynasty syndrome. The Manchu dynasty collapses in 1911, and China is beset by warlordism and civil war. Japan seizes that opportunity to seize Manchuria, the northeasternmost province of China, from China in 1931. This is not the clearly worked out policy of the Japanese government. Some hot-headed lieutenant colonels and the Japanese field army on the continent cooked up this plot to launch a provocation and invade Manchuria. A few years later, in 1937, a little incident. A few dozen Japanese troops and a few dozen Chinese troops clash in the suburbs of Peking, modern-day Beijing, the capital, and a little skirmish escalates out of control. And again, this is not the policy of the Japanese government, but hot-headed, field-grade Japanese officers on the continent take the bit in their teeth and escalate and escalate and escalate to what becomes a full-scale Sino-Japanese war, which lasted from 1937 to 1945. The government in Tokyo was unable to restrain their field armies on the continent. And this sounds strange. This is the way things worked in Imperial Japan at that time. Okay, so here we are. Here's a map of Northeast Asia. Here's Manchuria, China, Beijing, Japan, Korea, the Soviet Far East, Eastern Siberia, Mongolia, huge country. And here's a salient of Mongolia that kind of pokes eastward into northern Manchuria. And right here at the tip of this Mongolian salient, poking into Manchuria, that's where the 1939 battle that I'm so interested in took place. When Japan seized Manchuria in 1931, it inherited a 3,000-mile-long border with the Soviet Union and with the Soviets' ally, Mongolia, at that time the Mongolian People's Republic, the only other communist government in the world. Most of this boundary was river. Come back here, cursor. You've got the Amur River and the Ussuri River, but this piece of the boundary here, where Mongolia is, was not very well demarcated, and it was ripe for border conflict. In the years between 1931 and 1945, there were more than 1,000 border incidents along Manchuria's border with the Soviet Union and Mongolia. The one that I'm interested in, let's call it by its Japanese name, the Nomonhan incident, was not some little border clash. It was a small, undeclared war. Over 100,000 men, 1,000 tanks, 1,000 aircraft, 30 to 50,000 men killed and wounded in 4 months of intense combat. This is big-time combat. Furthermore, the fighting reached its climax at the end of August 1939. It coincided precisely with the conclusion of the German-Soviet non-aggression pact and the outbreak of the Second World War in Europe. When I was a graduate student, I stumbled upon this. I said, the Soviets are fighting the Japanese. The Japanese are aligned with the Germans. Stalin winds up signing an alliance with Hitler. You think there could be some connection here? And yet, in the standard histories of the coming of the Second World War in Europe, this is almost totally overlooked. And so it became a doctoral dissertation, and it became the focus of my academic research for a whole lifetime. Okay, so this is a blow-up of that end piece of that Mongolian salient that pokes into Manchuria, and at the eastern tip of that, there's a little river here. In Mongolian, it's Khalkhin Gol. Gol is the Mongolian word for river, and the Japanese and their Manchurian clients consider this river the boundary between Mongolia and Manchuria. The Mongolians and their Soviet allies said that the boundary was out here, some miles east of the river. So this territory between the river and this line was in dispute between them. At its broadest point here, it's about 10 or 12 miles across, maybe 40 miles from end to end. This was the disputed territory. It was a relatively quiet part of the border until April of 1939. In April of 1939, the Japanese Army of Occupation in Manchuria issued new guidelines for how local Japanese border commanders were supposed to deal with border conflicts. And what I've excerpted here this is the actual language from Guantanamo Operation Order 1488, which says it's permissible to enter Soviet territory or Mongolian territory, or to trap or lure Soviet or Mongolian troops onto Manchukuo territory. Where boundaries are unclear, local Japanese commanders will establish boundaries on their own initiative. In the event of an armed clash, fight on to victory, regardless of the location or boundaries. Consequences will be the responsibility of Kwantung Army headquarters. This is the order that was put into place at the last week of April 1939. What a surprise! A couple of weeks later, a little border incident occurs, but this one doesn't get brushed under the rug. Because of this order, the local Japanese commander feels a responsibility to take strong action, and that's what leads to the escalation of this border conflict into what I call a small undeclared war. This guy, Tsuji, is a major in the Kwantung Army. He was the guy who drafted that order, that border order. And even though he's only a lowly major, he's this type A personality, highly charismatic, forceful, dynamic, influential guy. His opinions actually became dominant at Kwantung Army headquarters. This guy, more than any other Japanese individual, is responsible for the provocation and the escalation of this fight, in the first instance with Mongolian forces and later with Soviet forces. My next book's going to be a biography of this guy. He's a wild man. End of May, the local Japanese commander in this region decides that the Soviet and Mongolian forces are stubbornly holding on to that disputed strip of territory between the river and the boundary line that the Mongol and Soviet forces claim. Japanese decide they need to send a big force down there and wipe these guys out. They set out with 2,000 men to crush this, what they consider an invasion of Manchurian territory. The Japanese believe they're facing some Mongolian cavalry and a handful of Soviet light infantry. Actually, the Soviets have reinforced the Mongolian allies. They've got about 1,000 men in the area, and more important, armored cars and artillery. And on the second day of the fight, the Red Army brings in 2 fresh Soviet infantry battalions, and the Japanese are really unprepared for this. When you hear the word armored car, and for years when I read about these armored cars in the desert of Mongolia, I had this picture in my head, and maybe you do too, of something like a 1930s version of a Brinks or Wells Fargo truck that would carry money to the bank. But actually, this is a Soviet armored car, and it's got the turret and high-velocity gun of a medium tank. It's a serious armored fighting vehicle. The Japanese decide with their 2,000 men they're going to send the main force. So here's the Khalkha River here, and there are some Mongolian and Soviet forces here, and some Mongolian and Soviet forces here. Japanese are going to send their main force down this way. They're going to send another blocking force down here. They're going to catch the Mongol Soviet forces in between them and crush them. But the Mongol Soviet forces are a lot stronger than the Japanese anticipate, and these guys wind up getting surrounded and wiped out. About 200 men were killed. The whole operation was a dismal failure from the Japanese point of view. But the Soviet side is impressed with the fact that the Japanese are taking this seriously. So Moscow sends reinforcements to the Mongolian front. And in the first instance, they send a young cavalry general named Georgy Zhukov. Zhukov, who would later become the commander of the Red Army in the Second World War against Germany. The Soviet version of Dwight Eisenhower and Douglas MacArthur all rolled into one. A guy who knew his business. And he is sent to take charge of the fighting on the Mongolia frontier. And that gives Zhukov powerful reinforcements of mechanized infantry, artillery, aircraft, and lots of armor. This part of Mongolia is wide open, flat country. If you've ever seen the Texas Panhandle, no trees, some slight rolling hills, mostly flat open country. This is tank country. Zhukov knows tanks. I referred earlier to this Japanese Imperial Army tradition of kind of institutionalized insubordination, whereby the field armies kind of take the bit in their mouth and sometimes run roughshod over government policy. The Japanese government and the Army High Command were opposed to expansion of the fighting at this incident. But the local field commanders, and especially the mid-grade staff officers, majors and lieutenant colonels, take responsibility for escalating things. And this guy, Major Tsuji, is the ringleader of this whole clique. And Tsuji draws up a plan, which he sells to the Kwantung Army High Command to make a major attack across the Halha River. We're going to send 15,000 men, and we're going to reinforce this infantry force with the only independent tank brigade in the whole Imperial Japanese Army, and we're going to crush these Mongolian and Soviet invaders once and for all. At this time, the Japanese believe that they're facing about 1,000 combined Soviet-Mongolian troops. Actually, Zhukov has 8,000 men in the area. More important, he's got 300 tanks and armored cars. Major Tsuji draws up the combat plan. And it's really a more muscular version of what they tried to do in May. Only now he's going to put 10 or 12,000 men across the river into what, even by Japanese definitions, is uncontestably Mongolian territory, west of the Khalkhangol. And he's going to send his tank brigade with a mechanized with an infantry regiment around here, catch the Soviet Mongolian forces in between and annihilate them. The language that the Japanese used in preparing this plan, and I've actually read the preparation orders. They said, we're going to dismember the Soviet and Mongolian forces in this area like a meat cleaver chopping up a chicken. And that's how confident that they were. Totally failing to note the magnitude of the reinforcements that Moscow and the Mongolian government in Ulaanbaatar have sent to the combat zone. The Japanese successfully build their own bridge across the river, and they sneak across a whole infantry division across the river, and Zhukov doesn't even notice it. But then when they launch the big attack, Zhukov is able to use his preponderance of tank strength to block the Japanese assault. A big fight goes on for 2 or 3 days, a bloody mess, thousands of people are killed on both sides. At the end of the day, the weight and firepower of Soviet armor prevents the Japanese from achieving their goals, and again they have to retreat. Another humiliating defeat for the Japanese. This is what a Japanese medium tank looks like. The Japanese never built a decent tank. In fact, even by 1945, they still didn't have a decent tank. It's a piece of tin with a puny little cannon up here, easily penetrated by. This is a Soviet BT-7 medium tank with a very famous Soviet tank commander here who looks surprisingly like someone you know. High velocity 45 millimeter cannon punches holes in these Japanese tanks as if they were paper mache. After the failure of the Japanese offensive in July across the river, the Japanese decided that they have to dig in and just hold on to this land, and they've kind of backed off from launching offensives, but we'll just dig in and hold on. The Japanese believe that there's really not much danger of a Soviet counteroffensive because they believe it's logistically impossible. According to Japanese military doctrine, it's impossible to launch any large-scale military operation more than 150 or 200 miles from the nearest railroad line. And the nearest railroad line to the battle zone was 400 miles away. The nearest Soviet Mongolian rail line was 400 miles away. The Japanese had a railhead only 50 miles from the combat zone. So they felt confident that for logistical reasons, if nothing else, they were secure there. But Moscow decided, and it is Stalin's decision, decided on large-scale reinforcement of Zhukov's forces in this Mongolian salient. And they organized a truck shuttle 4,200 trucks, day and night, back and forth between the railhead in Mongolia and the combat zone. Trucks driving at night with their lights out, carrying supplies to the combat zone, and during the day going back empty to get more. Japan, in all of Manchuria, had 800 trucks. The idea that the Soviets could be having this 4,200 truck shuttle was so totally beyond their comprehension that it was beyond their comprehension. Furthermore, their reconnaissance saw the Soviet trucks going westward, leaving the combat zone, going back towards central Mongolia during the day, and the Japanese interpreted that as the Soviets were retreating. What the Japanese were really seeing was the empty trucks going back to bring in more. Zhukov winds up with 4 infantry divisions, 2 Mongolian cavalry divisions, over 200 pieces of heavy artillery, almost 500 tanks and armored cars, and over 500 aircraft. And the Japanese don't see it coming. And here's Georgy Zhukov as a young man, 42 years old, planning his big counteroffensive with some of his commanders on the Mongolian steppe in early August 1939. And here's Zhukov's battle plan. He's gonna put most of his infantry and artillery on the central front, and hit the Japanese in the center, and fix the Japanese infantry there, and put his armor and mechanized infantry on the flanks, and send his tanks and mechanized infantry out around behind the Japanese, so that they meet up behind the Japanese. And here, this little dot is actually the tiny little village of Nomonhan, right on the border. And the Soviets succeed in forging a steel ring around the Japanese, who are trapped here in the middle. This offensive begins on the 20th of August, 1939. This business of sending the armor around the flanks is technically called a double vertical envelopment. It's a double vertical envelopment with armor. This becomes Zhukov's signature. This was Zhukov's first significant combat command. It was a brilliant success. This is what Zhukov is going to do at the Battle of Stalingrad, and at the Battle of Kursk, and many other battles in the Second World War. This is his first experience of modern armored combat. It was a battle of annihilation. When we say that an army was decimated, it means literally they lost 1 in 10. Decimated. The Japanese suffered over 75% killed in combat. That's what I mean when I say it was a battle of annihilation. And the Soviet offensive coincides precisely with the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, August 23rd, 1939, and the outbreak of the Second World War in Europe 1 week later, September 1st. So at the same time that this fight is reaching its peak, war is breaking out in Europe. Here's a photo of Soviet tanks about to go over the hill and attack the Japanese in August 1939. The second part of this book, the second part of this book talks about the impact of Nomonhan on the outbreak and the conduct and ultimately the outcome of the war. Back up a little bit. The Soviet worldview in the 1930s, again, the Soviet worldview, the world is composed of 3 mutually hostile and antagonistic blocks. There are the fascist, militarist capitalists, Germany, Japan, Italy. The bourgeois democratic capitalists, England and France, and maybe the United States, if the United States decides it's on the same planet, but they're not sure yet, because of isolationism in the United States. And then the communist bloc, which the Soviet Union and the Mongolian People's Republic. Stalin's nightmare is that the capitalists will gang up and combine against the USSR and crush the USSR. By the mid to late 1930s, Stalin is almost as worried just about the threat of Germany and Japan launching a 2-front war against the Soviet Union. In 1938, Soviet diplomacy is revealed to be very weak, and the Soviet Union is revealed to be very vulnerable, because in the Munich Agreement, where British Prime Minister Chamberlain sells out the Czechs and surrenders, for all intents and purposes, surrenders Czechoslovakia to the Nazis in a bloodless handover, while the Japanese aggression is proceeding further and further inland in China, moving westward. Stalin sees Hitler moving east and the Japanese moving west, and the Soviet Union in the middle. Furthermore, Japan and Germany were kind of allies in something called the Anti-Comintern Pact. However, in March of 1939, the 15th of March 1939, a huge event occurred which gets little attention in this country. Hitler tore up the Munich Agreement. At Munich, Hitler promised Chamberlain, the Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia is my last demand in Europe. Give me the Sudetenland and you won't hear any more from me. I don't have any more territorial ambitions in Europe. 6 months later, he invades the rest of Czechoslovakia and takes it over. Chamberlain was humiliated. This was a demonstration that Chamberlain's policy of appeasement, which up until that time, the word appeasement didn't have a bad sound to it. But Hitler showed that appeasement didn't work, that Hitler's appetite grew with the eating, and Chamberlain decides that we have to call a halt to Nazi aggression. It was apparent that the next item on Hitler's menu was Poland, and so at the end of March, Britain, with France following in its wake, give a unilateral guarantee: if Germany attacks Poland, we will fight Germany, says the British and French. Well, Chamberlain, who detests the Soviet Union, who detests communism, who's very suspicious of Stalin, is now thinking, I may actually have to fight the Germans. If I actually have to fight the Germans, it sure would be convenient to have the Soviets as an ally. They're good at that sort of thing. And so grudgingly, Chamberlain and French turn to Moscow and start talking to the Soviet government about some kind of alliance to deter Germany. Hitler, on the other hand, sees the British and French going to Moscow, and Hitler wants to avoid Germany's mistake of 1914 of fighting the British and French and the Russians at the same time. And so when the British and French come to Moscow, it makes Hitler nervous, and so the Germans look with a different eye toward the Soviet Union. It gives Stalin the opening to begin secret talks with the Germans, and the Germans take the bait. So now, in the spring and summer of 1939, the British and French and the Germans are coming a courting in Moscow, trying to see if they can reach, or who can reach, some kind of agreement with the Soviet Union. And in effect, Stalin finds himself, not by accident, this is Stalin's design, Stalin finds himself in a position where, in effect, he can choose between allying with England and France against Germany, or lining up with Germany. Well, we know what decision he made, of course. And this is an actual photograph of the German Foreign Minister, von Ribbentrop, signing the notorious German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact. And there's Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov, who will sign in just another minute, with Stalin grinning like a Cheshire cat, hovering in the background in the Kremlin. There are many reasons why Stalin made the decision that he did. In the first instance, his alliance with Hitler sets up an intra-capitalist war. The British and French are going to fight the Germans, and the Soviet Union is on the sidelines. Perfect. Not only that, but while this was going on, the Japanese are fighting the Russians, and the Japanese are talking to the Germans, trying to get the Germans to convert their Anti-Comintern Pact into an all-out military alliance, Germany and Japan, against the Soviet Union. And Stalin knows it, because the most important spy in the whole Second World War was a communist spy in Tokyo, who was a confidant of the German ambassador in Tokyo, and whose #1 operative was on the staff of the Japanese Prime Minister. And this guy, Richard Sorga, was able to keep Moscow informed of the Japanese attempts to draw Germany into an anti-Soviet military alliance. This Richard Sorga, the most important spy in the Second World War. So, faced with a decision between allying with Britain and France or allying with the Soviet Union, it's an easy decision for Stalin. Not only does he set up this conflict between the capitalists, England, France, and Germany, but Soviet Union is on the sidelines. He can turn around and smash the Japanese in the Battle of Khalkhin Gol, which is exactly what he does. And so that's the way these events play out. And when I first read about this, when I was a graduate student in the 1960s, it leaped out at me that there's got to be some connection between these events. And even in the published German diplomatic documents that were published in 1948, we see that when Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov was speaking to the Germans, 4 times the German ambassador in Moscow asked, in effect, "What do you guys want in order for us to get together?" And 4 times Molotov reads this long list of desiderata, things that Moscow wants. Each time, the very first thing at the top of the list is, we want Germany to use its good offices to get the Japanese to cease and desist from their aggression on the Mongolian frontier. The non-aggression pact was more than a non-aggression pact. It was, in fact, a military alliance. It called upon Japan, it called upon the Soviet Union to join Germany in attacking Poland and to they divided Poland between them. Germany invades Poland on September 1st. As early as September 3rd, the Germans are cabling Moscow. When are you guys going to come in from the east? We're waiting for you to invade Poland from the east. The Red Army is poised on the Polish frontier. It doesn't move. Day after day, the Germans keep saying, "When already? Come on, we would like your help." The Red Army doesn't move. On September 16th, a ceasefire goes into effect on the Khalkhin Gol and Nomonhan battlefield, and Japanese and Soviet and Mongolian commanders signed the ceasefire for this fight on the Mongolian frontier. The next morning, the Red Army invades Poland. I submit that this is not a coincidence. Stalin was damn sure that he was not going to get involved in some kind of fight in Europe until he was sure that the situation was taken care of on his eastern flank. I believe that Stalin believed that 1939 was going to be kind of like 1914. That is, England and France and Germany would be more or less evenly matched. They would bleed each other white, the way they had in the trenches in the First World War. And after a year or 2 or 3, the Soviet Union would emerge as the master of Europe. Well, of course, the German army made short work of Poland. Who could have imagined that a year later, France would fall as quickly as Poland had, and that the British army would be sent packing for its life across the English Channel, leaving all this heavy equipment behind at Dunkirk. And suddenly it became evident that Stalin had gotten more than he bargained for in his alliance with Hitler. Now imagine that you've got some kind of TV remote control in your hand. Fast forward 2 years. It's now the summer of 1941. Germany has just invaded the Soviet Union. The successes of the German army in the early months of this war were astonishing. In 4 months, the German army plunged further into the Soviet Union than the Imperial German Army had in 4 years, from 1914 to 1918. And military experts the world over predicted that the Red Army was on the verge of collapse, and the Soviet Union would probably be defeated in a matter of months, if not weeks. And the Germans turn to the Japanese and say to Tokyo, "This is your chance to get even with the Soviets. for the humiliating defeat they inflicted on you at Khalkhin-Gol, Nomonhan 2 years ago. Attack the Soviet Far East, but do it now. 6 months from now, I won't need you. It'll be over. Do it now. And this appeal is very attractive, especially to Japanese army guys. But at the same time that the Germans have invaded the Soviet Union, President Roosevelt has slapped an oil embargo on Japan to try to get the Japanese to back off of their aggression in China. And almost all the oil in the world that Japan has access to is controlled by the United States and Britain and our friends and allies. Who was exporting oil in those days? Canada, United States, Mexico, Venezuela, some British colonies in the Persian Gulf. The Russians had oil in Baku. Oh yeah, one other place. The Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia, was already a major oil producer and exporter. The Netherlands had already been conquered by Germany. There's a handful of Dutch colonial troops mining the store in the East Indies. The Japanese know they can get that oil. But they believe that the Americans will fight to prevent them from doing it. And this, for those of you who may not realize it, is the underlying reason for the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. This is what the Pacific War was all about. But in addition, this Nomonhan and Khalkhin-Gol battle also played a significant part in the Japanese decision to attack Pearl Harbor. Let me back up here. Here's the way that worked. In July, August, September 1941, there were actually debates in Tokyo among the Japanese military brass and government leaders. Historians call it the Japanese Imperial War Conferences. And the debate was, are we going to listen to the Germans and attack the Soviet Far East, or are we going to go south and get that oil, which means war with America? And what I'm about to say is a little bit of an oversimplification, but in substantial part it was an Army versus Navy debate. And the Navy was intent on getting that oil and going south, which meant war with America. A lot of the Army guys liked this idea of throwing in with the Germans and attacking the Soviet Far East. I have it from Japanese sources that the most influential Japanese Army voice in this debate in Tokyo was none other than our friend Tsuji from Nomonhan, who now is the director of a division of the operations staff at Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo. And Tsuji, this very influential, charismatic guy, stands up and says, I have experienced Soviet firepower firsthand. You don't want to do that again. And I'm not trying to say that this was the main reason for the Japanese decision to attack Pearl Harbor. No. But we know for sure from Japanese sources that this argument played into the balance. It was a factor in the Japanese calculations. But what if there had been no battle at Khalkhin-Gol or Nomonhan in 1939? What if the Japanese army didn't have this healthy respect for Soviet firepower? What if Japan had attacked the Soviet Far East in the second half of 1941? Many military experts, including people I know on the staff of the Institute of Military History of the Russian Ministry of Defense, argue that the USSR could not have survived a two-front war in 1941 to 1942. Zhukov was given command of the Red Army in this moment of crisis when it appeared that the Red Army was on the verge of collapse, in substantial part because he had proved himself in this fight against the Japanese 2 years earlier. A lot of people believe that the most important and decisive battle on the Eastern Front in Europe, which is to say the most important and decisive battle of the Second World War, was Stalingrad. But an argument can be made, and I make that argument, and many others buy into this argument, that really a year before Stalingrad, the Battle of Moscow was the most critically important and decisive battle of the war, because it was at the gates of Moscow in the autumn and early winter of 1941 that the German army came closest to breaking the back of the Red Army, and it was a very, very near thing. because Stalin, unlike Tsar Alexander I in 1812, who surrendered Moscow without defending it to Napoleon, Stalin made a decision to stand and fight at Moscow. And not just to make a fight of it, but to stand and hold Moscow at all costs. And he threw all of his reserves into that fight. And Hitler, in Operation Typhoon, concentrated the full strength of the Wehrmacht, finally, belatedly, on Moscow. It was the biggest battle of the Second World War. If you take the whole operation from beginning to end, it was like about 7 million men, almost 2 million killed on both sides. It's a titanic struggle. At the last moment, just before the Soviets counterattacked, the lead German panzer units could see the spires of the Kremlin in their binoculars. That's how close they got. They were in the suburbs of Moscow. That's how close they got. But that guy, Richard Sorge, the most important spy in the Second World War, is able to tell Moscow in September, October 1941 that the Japanese have made an irrevocable decision to go south, that will not attack the Soviet Far East. And so Stalin makes the decision that he can now transfer his Far Eastern reserves from the Soviet Far East to the Moscow front. And in October and November 1941, 15 infantry divisions and 1,700 airplanes and 1,500 tanks are sent from the Soviet Far East to the Moscow front. And those troops are commanded by Zhukov. Some of them are the same troops that Zhukov led against the Japanese 2 years before. And on the 6th of December, 1941, Zhukov launches a counteroffensive against the Germans and throws the Germans back and pushes them back between 100 and 200 miles westward, away from Moscow, and holds them there all through the winter. This Soviet counteroffensive begins on December 6th, 1941. 1 day later, the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor. 3 days later, Germany declares war on the United States. And we declare war on Germany. This is the week that doomed the Axis. But it wasn't inevitable, because if the Japanese had decided differently, if the Japanese had attacked the Soviet Union in 1941, they couldn't also have attacked Pearl Harbor. So when then would the United States have entered the war? And under what circumstances? And if the Soviet Union were defeated in this two-front war, if the Soviet Union was defeated and surrendered to Germany in 1941 to 1942, I'm standing here telling you that I believe that the continent of Europe would be speaking German today. That the second language would not be English. An epilogue about two-front war. All of the major combatants in the Second World War fought two-front wars. Germany, of course, in North Africa, in Western Europe, the Mediterranean, and the Eastern Front, and were defeated in detail in all of them. Japan also fought in the Western Pacific, in the South Pacific, the China-India-Burma theater, and they didn't have the strength to do that. England also fought in Europe and East Asia, barely survived in Europe, and by dint of American power, we restored the British position in Asia in 1945. Only the United States was strong enough to prosecute this two-front war successfully. But only the Soviet Union avoided a two-front war altogether. And for all of Stalin's faults, and I assure you, I am no admirer of Stalin, for all of Stalin's faults, this was perhaps his greatest achievement, and that's what saved the Soviet Union. And that's why I call this battle maybe the most important World War II battle you never heard of. Okay. You've been super patient.